My guest today is Nik Sharma, a molecular biologist turned food stylist, recipe developer, and cookbook author. So, Nik, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah, I'm really glad to get to talk to you. I bought your food science book, actually pre-ordered it before it even came out, so it's great to get to talk to you in person. So you grew up in Bombay, right, now Mumbai, and you started your career in molecular biology, but you later found your passion in cooking. So can you talk a little bit about your journey and what your biggest influences were?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born and brought up in Bombay, and I think one of the things growing up in an Asian society, you're always kind of pushed into a career that's much more stable because I guess it is the wisdom of your parents in a way. But,
Yeah.
uh, but my mother worked in the hotel industry, and my dad worked in actually he trained in fine arts, his degrees in fine arts, and then became a photographer to survive. So I think that was one of the reasons that my father and my mother really never pushed me into doing something like cooking or becoming a chef,
Mm-hmm.
or even a photographer, though I didn't display any interest in photography even back then. And they said you should go into medicine. And I was interested in biology. I thought it was the most fascinating subject in school. Uh, Biology and chemistry, followed by math, were my three favorite things. And then French. French was my second language in school, so that was my favorite thing. Beyond that, I hated everything else in school. So it just made natural sense for me to put all of these things together, leave the French out, but put all those science things and the maths together. And that's kind of where I went onto that journey. And it was fascinating because I could see things that I had seen at home d-
Mm-hmm.
come to life in the lab, but then also vice versa. And I had never made that connection until I studied science in school. And I think this is something that when I talk, I tell people that it is so important to have teachers in school that give you those real life examples where you see math and science applied in real life, which is then what draws you into it. And so for me, those were the seeds that made me realize that life in itself is you're living out an experiment in many ways, right? Even just life, and I'm getting very philosophical here, but life is also a lot of the trial and error, and then you're moving along, learning things, trying new things, and that's the same thing with science as well as cooking in the kitchen. And I would watch, family members cook. My mother doesn't cook a lot, that's why I said family members. Uh, but like my grandmother and my aunts, my mom's sisters, they would do certain things when they made a dish the same way again and again. And I would always wonder, why do you have to do it this way? Why can't you just throw everything together? And then when you talk to them and they'll tell you, if I did it this way, it may not work. I'm doing it this way because it's probably faster and it still tastes good. So stuff like that I would just file those things at the back of my head. And later on, when I graduated from school, I had a friend who was going into culinary school. And I told my mom, I said, oh, he's going to culinary school. I kind of want to do it, be just like him. That sounds so exciting. And she said, no, I see the culinary students that come for internships at the hotel that she worked at. And she said, you don't have the drive and the stamina in you to be in a cold room where your fingers get nipped when you're peeling onions. That takes a toll on you. She said, I've seen those kids. It's miserable. It's awful. And you don't have the hustle. That was the other thing. My parents always said that I'm not a
Mm-hmm.
hustler, but maybe I'm not. Um, but you need those things to survive in that tough environment. And I said, okay, they're probably right. And I pursued a career in science. That's how I came to America. I applied for grad school, and I was accepted into a couple of programs. It also enabled me to finance my education. So I was on a graduate research assistantship at the University of Cincinnati at the College of Medicine, studying molecular
Mm-hmm.
genetics. And that was I guess, my professional journey into the world of science.
I also have a little bit of similar background. I was really into science, chemistry, and math in high school, and I actually started college as a math major. I actually switched to music, but
Okay.
my first job was in technology, working for Apple. And while I was there, I got accepted into a program, and I started doing molecular biology research at Stanford. And I think, like you, that background and that sort of scientific approach has really helped me in terms of how I think about food and recipes and how you develop recipes, but also do recipes. So one thing I wanted to ask you also is, with that background, your approach when you're doing other people's recipes, I'm sure you're always in the back of your mind kind of thinking about why these steps and is this really the best way to do it, and kind of tinkering around and seeing both in terms of improving the product and also in terms of improving the process. Is that something you're always doing, and kind of what's your approach to that?
So I'll be honest. Well, I should be approaching things like that when I see recipes, but a couple of months ago, I saw a recipe on Instagram on a video that I think it had 7 million views or something. So I said, oh my gosh, everyone's commenting about how easy it is to make ricotta. I think she was making ricotta. Yeah, ricotta at home. And I said, oh, this sounds really easy. And I completely forgot everything I had been trained in, both in cooking as well as in science. And I said, okay, like 7 million views, all these like hundreds of comments, it's a done deal, right? Like what? Like come on, everyone's like so happy with the ricotta that was made, and it looks realistic in the video. So I go and I make it, and this person's recipe has a really low boiling point for milk. That was the number one flag for me, which I should have paid attention to. The second thing was they said you don't. I think they used lemon juice, which is fine. You can use citric acid to curdle milk, right? They use that, and it's kept. It's the milk is warmed up. You put that in, and then she passes it through a fine mesh strainer. Okay, and I did everything, and literally, it just like everything just flowed through. Right? Said, well, you're such an idiot for doing that because you know that the milk needs to be boiled or like heated really close to the boiling point in order for those proteins to get stretched out and denatured, and that's when you would add the lemon juice in, not before and then like you don't even heat it up. Like it'll curdle slightly. Yes, the milk will curdle, but it's not squeezed tightly, where it becomes more what you say non-polar on the outside. The amino acids are non-polar on the outside, and so then that is what would sit through and hold back in the fine mesh strainer, not something that's kind of lukewarm. And I said, what is wrong with you? You're such an idiot because you knew this. And I said, okay, so that was my lesson where I said, okay, I need to really like pay attention the next time I approach something with millions of views on TikTok or Instagram, because quite likely they don't work. And I think it's just done for views. But you're right. Yes, in terms of cooking, when I'm approaching someone else's recipes, sometimes there are moments where you can tell if the recipe is going to work. Um, with flavors, it's a little harder unless you're experienced with the aromas and the taste. It's I can imagine what the dish will taste in my mind before I put it together, and I try to do that with other people's recipes. And also, taste is something that is so subjective, so I know certain things I'll need to tweak beforehand. But yeah, I mean, the chemistry and physics of things, sometimes it's easy just to predict from a recipe. You'll know when things are going to roast and not roast properly, whether they're going to be crunchy or dry, depending on how long they're cooked. And sometimes vegetables and even meats, they contain too much water in them. Is that actually going to end up as crispy as people say it is, right? So those are the things you start paying attention to.
And one thing that's interesting in some of your books, an experienced chef, as you say, will be able to look at these ingredients and think about, in their mind, kind of predict how they're going to taste together. And in a lot of cases, put together really interesting combinations of flavors that someone may not have thought of that work, that are like, even to another experienced chef looking at those ingredients, this just sounds really weird. But then you try them together and it's, oh, this is genius. And I think it was in your science book, the second book you wrote, you have a really interesting section where you talk about the different flavor profiles around the world and the shared compounds, the molecular compounds that are common among different ingredients, and how many are shared in certain flavor profile countries or flavor profiles, and other flavor profiles where there are very few of those compounds that are shared. And I really love your kind of thinking about that, and also putting together recipes that really kind of go outside the bounds of some of the traditional pairings that you would find.
Yeah, I think, one of those things with that paper is I know it's a controversial paper because some people in like in the food world don't agree with it and some people do. I think one of the problems with the world of everybody is trying to find the formula for flavor pairings. Everybody's trying to narrow it down to A plus B equals C, and then that way A plus B always equals C. And I think one of the problems with that is once you start to define things and try to make it that way, the innovation stifles. Innovation then becomes is based on the biases that you've created with those formulas, right? Because then it sets up this parameter that these are the laws of flavor pairing, and you can't step outside of it. So then, if someone is a young chef or someone who is an experienced chef looks at those formulas and they say, okay, this is the way it's supposed to be, right? So then you're creating this boundary. And I think for me, that's the same thing with recipes and traditions is one of the things people do is they're so attached to traditions, which is something I didn't grow up with because just of my background, my family background. I came from different cultures. And for me, I never thought in terms of I have to eat four dishes from the same culture at the same time. I can also draw those flavors and put them in together. And I think that's something that I see with flavor, all these books or attempts to narrow down these things to chemical formulas and books that are so focused on traditions where you can't step away is problematic because at the end of the day, the planet and even people have been migrating for centuries. They're taking things with them, and even ingredients like plants and animals that we consume are also naturally evolving over time. They're also moving, right? Like the tomato, for example, that wasn't something that was a part of so many cultures for centuries. It was something that not grew up, something that arose in Central America and South America and then moved to the rest of the world. It also changed as a vegetable. Like there are so many varieties now than what the tiny little tomato that I think it first came I might be wrong on this, Chile or Bolivia or somewhere, but it's just so different right now. It's part of like Italian culture where it had nothing to do with Italy, right? Except through colonialism. So I think those are the kind of things people need to keep in mind that ingredients, we will be gone tomorrow, but ingredients and things, recipes and traditions are all also evolving over time. And it's okay to bring these flavors in to create new pairings because at the end of the day, you want that experience. Some things will work and some things don't. So that's how I approach cooking. And one of the things I enjoyed about that paper was they showed something that I have always questioned. I'm always looking at the similarities. And, in school, you're taught compare and contrast in science, right? And compare and contrast. And you look at what are people doing with meat. And for example, meat, people love to eat meat and potatoes together. It's comfort food for so many cultures. But the way they approach that combination is so different. In America, like my husband's from the West, he's from Virginia. It's pretty much meat, potatoes with salt and pepper, maybe barbecue sauce sometimes, or um, what is that, liquid smoke. And then you go to countries like India, and they'll take meat and potatoes, but they'll add a lot of spices. There'll be vinegar, there'll be lemon juice, chilies, and it just gets, people start building up on this thing. So there are similar patterns, but there are also contrasts between them. And for me, that's something really fascinating to watch in food.
Yeah, that's just really interesting. And the example you give of Italy and tomatoes is a great example because, as you mentioned, tomatoes are fairly recent to Italian, but we so strongly associate them with Italian cooking now. And and you're right, a lot of people really have very strong feelings about what a flavor profile or what a dish should be. There's on the American Culinary Federation. I'm a member of this online group of chefs, and there's right now actually a discussion about certain foods, and someone suggested, oh, for like beef Wellington, we should update it and do it this and this and this. And all these people came in and said, no, this is traditional dish, it has to be made this way, and you have to use this Dexel and so forth. And same thing with all these other dishes. So some people are really just set on this is what this dish is, and if you're going to make something else, that's fine, but don't try to pretend like it's this thing over here. And the same thing with cuisines. People are really set on what a cuisine is and what that means, and eating those things together, like you say. So, I love that. I do like doing some things the traditional way,
Hmm.
maybe not cooking them exactly, because
Sure.
I always try to find better ways to do things, but at the same time, food should evolve just like language or anything else, and so we need to be open to trying new things and not being so stuck in those
Hmm.
kinds of patterns. And that's why I found it so interesting in your book when you talk about that, and really kind of pushing the envelope of mixing different types of things together that you wouldn't expect, and creating something new and really interesting out of that.
One of the things I'll give as an example is that when I go back to India for trips, they don't really care about all this. And I think the burden, and this may be coming from the immigrant experiences, where when we're kept away from the countries we were born in, or maybe our parents came from those countries, right? We're holding on to the definitions of traditions that our parents gave us, or the family gave us, or that, we
Mm-hmm.
would really want to hold on to the connection because you don't have it here. And I think that's part of it's not a problem, but it is part of the force that drives this conversation. And then you go to countries like India, and you'll see that they don't care at the end of the day. They are doing whatever they want to with the food, and they're having fun with it. And I think a lot of I get a lot of inspiration when I get to travel. And I went to India recently, actually not recently, 4 years ago, and right before the pandemic, and they had this dish that I had never eaten before. It was they had done so in India they have these flaky flatbreads called parathas, which is like a
Mm-hmm.
whole wheat bread, and then people stuff them, and sometimes people don't. These guys had taken Nutella inside. Now I know if I had done something like that and posted here, I'd be kind of like Game of Thrones, where like made to parade around the city in shame.
Uh-huh.
But like in India, everyone was getting it and they were happy with it, and everyone it was tasty and it was good. And so I think like one of the when you go to the like countries where we're holding on to these notions, and you just pay attention to what the young crowd is doing. They're just having fun when they cook. And I think that's something we forget to do sometimes with cooking, is kind of take a
Yeah.
pause, enjoy that moment, because you're there. Yes, you're there to cook for your family and get nourished and everything, but you can't, and not everyone gets relaxed while cooking, but take a breather, right? Like just enjoy the moment if you can. And I think as chefs, that's something we really need to do sometimes, not make it always about the job, and remember, this is why I came here. This is why I want to do it. This is why I'm excited.
You started off, when you were first changing your career, even before you changed your career, you started working as a pastry chef. And
Hmm.
I'm not sure how far along, that path that you got with that. I know you have some pastry recipes that you do, and ice cream, is a passion I think you and I both share. But so I'm just curious how much you enjoy both making and developing, baking and pastry recipes versus savory
Hmm.
recipes, and they're kind of very different approaches typically.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the things that happened my career kind of when I came into food, so I came into food, I'd started the blog, and I was still working at a pharmaceutical company doing drug testing. And at that point, I decided I wanted to go to cooking school. And again, like the loan situation was scary, so I said I'm just going to go and work and stage and see how I like it. So I worked at a patisserie in Northern California, and then I did that for about a year and a half. So that was my uh, like training. That was my professional training. But at that point, what happened was I started to look for jobs because we were moving further north from South Bay to Oakland, and I had to leave that place. So what landed in my lap immediately, and this was by fate, was I got a job as a food photographer and stylist for a startup company in San Francisco, and they had chefs who were already creating dishes. So the money was better, to be honest, so I just went there. And it was some I also enjoy photography because of the blog, so it was fun. And that is what kind of changed it. I think if I didn't have that opportunity, I would have still tried to work in restaurants. But when I went there, that's when things changed for me. I got my first book deal, and then I also ended up quitting that startup company and became the columnist at the San Francisco Chronicle. When I did that, I realized that people don't make desserts a lot at home. So I'm writing for home cooks. I'm trying to empower them, teach them. And I realize they don't really make the dessert recipes often unless it's really simple. And I get that. Like pastry, especially like French and Japanese style, is a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
People don't have those tools at home. They're not going to do it, right? And I went into savory cooking. And so a lot of the recipes I share right now are predominantly savory stuff. And if I do desserts, it's really simple. Ice cream is like a passion, so I've never stayed away from it. And then if I try to do something more professional pastry, I never post that on the internet because A, people will bug me for the recipe. And I mean
Mm-hmm.
this in a nice way because I know they'll never cook it. It'll have the like, so it's a lot of effort for me to put that out there. So I only put things that I know people will actually make at home and enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, now I write for home cooks, but more recently I learned that I'm actually also writing uh, for the scientists and the physicians because that's my core audience. This is something that I've recently discovered, so it is exciting.
So when you're cooking for yourself at home, without an eye towards your professional career and writing recipes for other people, do you enjoy baking more or do you enjoy savory cooking more?
I enjoy ice cream making for us because I pretty
Mm-hmm.
much use my machine once or twice a week. And I may make it for myself or give it to someone. But after that, I would say I like the savory part because one of the things working in desserts taught me was flavor pairing because a lot of desserts are a blank slate and then you start
Mm-hmm.
throwing in things together to see how they work. And so that actually helped me become better at savory cooking so I can bring in concepts and sometimes even flavors that are commonly associated with desserts. So I'll use vanilla when I create pork or when I'm cooking something with pork
Mm-hmm.
because it just pairs beautifully. And then I'll also throw in saffron. I mean, of course, that's very Indian, like saffron, rose
Mm-hmm.
water, pandan. Those are all flavors of Southeast Asia, but they're used in desserts, right? And so those are the things that kind of inform me with uh, how to pair flavors, but also how much. That's another thing that I feel desserts teach you really well is to be more controlled in your spice levels, where people can appreciate the flavors of the key ingredients, but also the spices.
Mm-hmm.
And I love doing that when I'm roasting vegetables or just, even making a soup, something as simple as a soup or a salad dressing. Because you really have to think about those things. Is it overpowering? Is it too much? Is it too little? How do I achieve the balance?
So what ice cream maker do you use?
I have the Breville,
Oh, of
the
course you
one that
do.
gives the ice cream, what is it called? The ice cream bell comes
Mm-hmm.
off at the end.
Yeah, and you like that?
I do. I've had it for years, and you don't have to freeze anything in the oven before and bring out. I used to have the one from Cuisinart before,
Mm-hmm.
and never have enough space in the freezer just to keep a container there all the time. So this is kind of nice.
Yeah, I used to use the like the Cuisinart or the KitchenAid ones, uh, and I have the Musso now, which is so again you can just
Okay.
make it and I actually also have a Paco Jets.
Oh, that's impressive.
It's awesome. It's a great machine. You do have to plan ahead. And actually, I made a bunch of ice cream just yesterday, um, but yeah, you need to freeze it ahead of time. But I really like ice cream that's really soft, so I like it like right out of the
Mhm.
machine. My daughter likes it a little bit with more bite to it. So for
Okay.
her, I might do that and then freeze it. But the great thing about the Breville or the Musso is that you can just make your base, and you don't really even have to age it. You can just like throw it in, and within an hour and a half, you can have ice cream from beginning to
Oh,
end. Right.
nice.
So that is nice if you're just having people come over or whatever. You're just in the mood to
Yeah.
do something different. So going back to your career, I meant to ask you also. I know it's a little scary, kind of changing your career, especially when you're going from
Mm.
a science career that has a certain path and expectation
Yeah.
of growth in there to something like culinary. So I'm curious what advice you would give to other people, whether it's that they want to go into culinary or something else that's really their passion. Maybe they're not super happy in their job, but they feel like they're kind of stuck there because it's the responsible thing to do. Obviously, if you get worked out really well, and one thing I
Hmm.
feel strongly about is, following your passions. And if you're really passionate about what you do, you're going to succeed a lot more in it. And so in many careers, there's an opportunity for success if it's something that you really love doing and you're going to really put your heart into it.
Absolutely. I think one of the things is to learn how to define success. What does success means to you as an individual? And for some, it might be in the food world, it might be, owning a restaurant or maybe becoming a TV chef or writing a cookbook. Whatever the way you define it, stick to that. But in terms of switching careers, yeah, it was scary, and I still think about it quite a bit. I sometimes think that maybe I should switch back. And but I know what I want to do now when I switch back. I think one of the problems for me when I was younger was I was in science proceeding mindlessly. There was no aim. I was just doing it because I felt this path of research in cancer or in I did cancer research initially, and then I did virology, vaccines, and then after that I worked in metabolic diseases. And I think I enjoyed it. I love the fact that this work might help people someday. But at the same time, it wasn't what was meant for me, that path in research, that particular path. It was when I got into studying metabolic diseases at Georgetown, when I was at Georgetown Hospital, that's when I realized this is kind of interesting. I'm looking at food, and I was looking at high fructose diets and, looking at metabolic disorders and seeing how the bone dissolves when people have hyponatremia and all this stuff. So for me, it was this is food related. This is fascinating. I'm actually enjoying this type of research. That is at the same time that I started food blogging. So I think for me, that was when when I started food blogging, there's no talk of science at all. I just said, okay, I work in research and this. And I think for me, when the two paths converged, it took some time. I didn't do it until uh, I want to say before the flavor equation came out, years before the flavor equation came out, because I wasn't confident enough to feel like I could say I come from a science background in the food world, because I was trying to do everything that a chef would have done to be in that space. So I'd never, you can say it's the imposter syndrome, but I just didn't feel I was doing enough to satisfy the credentials of being seen seriously by the food world as someone who cooks and writes professionally. And after a while, I realized, God, I'm trying so hard to fit in. I'm struggling. But what am I enjoying at the end of the day? And I said, the books that I'm drawn to, those are the ones that perhaps are defining my interest, and I'm not paying attention to it. So I read a lot of cookbooks, as you can see, and the books that I'm drawn to are the ones that are about science. Some may not even have recipes; they just talk about the method of cooking. And those are the books that I was drawn to. And I said, this is my science background speaking to me in cooking, and maybe that is what I was meant to do and teach people, versus just creating recipes and sharing with them. Maybe my aim in life is to talk about the science of cooking and how that makes me a better cook in the kitchen. And that is when I said, okay, once I saw that and I accepted that I was a scientist or a person from science as well as a cook, it gave me a clearer focus on my path. And I think for me, that was instrumental. And I think for people who are debating in careers, like whether you want to switch or do something else, I think really see and look at what is driving you at the end of the day. It might not be obvious. Like for me, it really wasn't obvious, but I get excited when I talk about it. A lot of people have told me when they hear me talk about science, they get really excited. And I tell them, I said, I didn't realize that until people pointed it out. That's another thing. So pay attention to also the people around you when they tell you that you sound happy and you sound excited when you talk about certain aspects of food.
Are you sort of focusing back on like metabolic diseases or other things and diets for specific diseases and looking into doing research in those areas to figure out how people can approach, whether it's holistically or a combination of, Western science
Yeah,
in order
yeah.
to treat those diseases?
Uh, a little bit, not too much. But my right now, I've become really fascinated in reading about research that involves about the like more about the planet, like sustainability, in terms of how do we feed these billions of people, And is this going to happen on this planet, or is it going to go on another planet? So one of the, I was reading a paper in Nature that came out a couple of months ago, and I didn't know people were doing this. They are synthesizing the sugars that are produced in breast milk, as well as in dairy, in plants. And because I think baby food formula doesn't contain a lot of those carbohydrates, so they're trying to introduce those oligosaccharides into formula. And I thought that was
Right.
fascinating because it's not for everyone, truly, but there are like these corrective things taking place. And then also just going back to things like, the human gut, the microbes, the, kind of understanding. One of the things I really enjoyed in microbiology, my undergraduate degrees in microbiology, I love learning about things like how bacteria, if you go to a gas station and you take soil samples from there and you harvest those bacteria, those are the bacteria that degrade oil and petrol and diesel, and because they are living in that environment. So stuff like that I'm kind of getting back to and really enjoying reading the research about that. So if I had to go back into research, I would love to do something where it's about the planet, it's about better nutrient availability for people everywhere. How do we improve the quality of life on this planet versus going to another planet? Because I think we just need to deal with our situation here first before jumping off and going crazy elsewhere.
Yeah, that whole area of bacteriology and gut biome and so forth is really interesting to me. And there's so much research to be done still. I mean, there's so much that we don't know. And the more we're learning about how important it is in ways that we didn't even think about.
Absolutely. I think there's just like so much research. Also, some of the stuff that we considered as the older stuff, that we considered as dogma for the longest time, so much of that has also changed. Stuff that I learned in school is no longer like people, if you revisit things and you learn that so many things have changed. Like, just take the example of taste receptors. When I was in school, taste receptors were something that we always focused on in the mouth, in the oral cavity. But then now research has moved on so far ahead that they're present in other parts of the body, doing other things, not really involved
Right.
with taste. So, it's just so fascinating when you just go back and see how things have changed, and the body of research that's available. There's just so much, and the applications to food um, are huge. Like, we could actually increase the amount of nutrition we absorb from, say, an apple as an example. We might be able to increase the amount of nutrients absorbed from an apple than we were if we apply all this science. I think that's, for me, that's really fascinating that we could get to that stage and maybe move from, say, 70% efficiency to 90% efficiency.
Yeah, the taste receptors, like you mentioned, in other parts of your body, and other mechanisms that your body has for determining nutrients, the post-ingestive effects of foods, and how our body recognizes them, and how that drives our appetite for certain things, is really interesting. And there's so much that I think a lot of the food companies are definitely very interested in that, because they're developing highly processed foods to sort of take advantage of sort of hacking our systems so that we will crave those more and eat more of them. But yeah, that whole area of research and how we taste and how we smell, there's still so much we don't know about. I read a paper a few years ago on taste that was so different from when I originally studied it. And like, when I was doing molecular biology research, which I don't even want to tell you how long ago that was. And then, a few years ago, I started reading contemporary books again, and it was just amazing how much things had changed from when I first studied it. And, our knowledge is expanding so quickly, and yet you start to look into it and you realize, we're just barely scratching the surface of some of these things. There's so much we don't know.
Absolutely. And I think for me, if I had to go back into science or maybe do some combination of food science, that is an area that I would love to get back into.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So when you are, studying food and baking, recipe developing, and kind of using your scientific background, what are some things that you've really found interesting or surprising, or have really changed how you think about how food works and putting things together, and what you would, convey to other people interested in food science that you think would be really useful to them, just in terms of some of those things that they may not expect or understand about food.
One of the things I've learned, and this is something I put, I guess, when I was in my graduate school for my qualifying exam, we had to write for your qualifying exam, you had to write a thesis and defend it, or research proposal and defend it. And when you do that, you're taught to kind of answer a question in multiple ways possible, at least. And in my thesis, in my proposal, it was three different experiments to answer the same question to make sure you're getting close to the truth. And I realized in cooking, it's the same thing. You can make a stock, something as simple as a stock, in three different ways, and learn how to appreciate each of those three different methods. If you look at Chinese cooking, for example, they'll prepare stock in a very different way. And say it's bone broth, right? They'll roast the bones differently, and then you come to like maybe a different part of China or a different country, and they will not roast their bones, and they'll still make stock. And then you can also circumvent the whole thing by just buying some kind of bone powder and using that. And then you have people that are pressure cooking bones to make the stock, or boiling them for hours or days at a hotel, right? To make till the bone falls apart. So, in my opinion, those are all different experiments trying to achieve the same goal, and getting closer to the truth. So, kind of appreciate that there are different ways to approach the beast and grab it by the horn, the bull by the horns. Um, and that to me is a very scientific approach in cooking. So pay attention to that. Keep an open mind, because sometimes the most unexpected thing might be the solution to your problem. And often I feel like it's the simplest technique, or the simplest answer, the simplest procedure that gets you that answer, versus going all around. Like I've seen people boiling, like I think right now one of the things, I'll give you an example, is boiling eggs. Everybody is obsessed with finding the perfect method to boil an egg. And there are many different methods. Personally, I like sous vide. Some people love pressure cooking. But I think many years ago, maybe 30 years ago, in New Scientist, there was a formula for I think it's a calculus formula for that takes into account the diameter of the egg, the size of the egg, the temperature that the egg is starting out at, and what temperature you want the egg to be at, right? Apply that formula, because we all know what the temperature should be of eggs when they're mixed, what the yolk sets at, when the yolk is runny, when the white is runny. So we have all this stuff. That's the other thing I feel, that don't waste when the answer is already there, right? That's also, I think, something my professors taught me in science was, if make sure the answer is not already there, because what's the point of you doing something like that? What are you adding, right? And so I see this a lot, especially with eggs and cookies and stuff, where people have already published this data. They've actually derived mathematical formula. Why are you kind of like going down this weird path of trying to impress people? So kind of those kind of things also is the other side, where it's just so easy to read and look these things up. So read as much as you can, and then think about, has someone already done this, and what am I adding new here? Because in science, you're taught to look for the gap and fill the gap. That's how you enrich people's lives and make them better. I think that's an approach we should have in cooking too.
Yeah, and I think some of that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is this traditional way of doing things versus kind of relooking at it. And I like to sous vide my eggs as well, to cook them, and everyone in my family likes them at a different, amount of doneness. And so, you do them for 8 minutes and pull some out, and then you do the next batch then you leave them in for 2 minutes longer, and then another half a minute after
Yeah.
that, and everyone has their perfectly cooked egg. And you know exactly how long that's going to be, and so it's really easy to do,
Yeah.
and it works great. A few years ago, I saw, I make my own vanilla.
Okay.
And basically, you cut, and you don't even really have to take the seeds out, and you put them in vodka or some other alcohol, and you let them sit for 2 months, right? And that's basically it. But there's a method of sous videing it, which is, where you can do it in a day. And I actually haven't yet done the experiment of doing a side-by-side, controlled experiment and testing and doing a triangle test and whatever to
Hmm.
see if there's really improvement one over another. But there's so many things like that where you can sort of, hack a method of doing something, and there are a lot of people who are like, no, this has to be done the traditional way, and it's going to be, and I don't know if there's a 5% difference or how much you'd be able to tell, or if there's really no difference, or if this
Hmm.
way's better. That's one thing I'm always looking at when I do someone else's recipe is I'm always thinking, why are they doing it this way, and can this be simplified or improved in terms of the product, or improved in terms of how long it takes. Yeah, you talk about making stock, and lots of people, if you cut up the bones, it's going to the flavors are going to infuse a lot faster. Some people add gelatin in,
Hmm.
just buy gelatin, sheets or granules or whatever. Uh, so I think it's really important to look at doing those things, and especially if you're in production or in a commercial kitchen or a production kitchen, those things are going to be important. But even for a home cook, why not make things as simple as possible and get the best
Hmm.
possible results? I really like to cook and bake, and so I don't mind spending the time. And I like doing things with my hands and getting in there. And so for me, I get pleasure out of doing something that maybe there's a faster, easier way. If I feel like there's really no point in doing it that way, and I might as well do it this way, then maybe I won't, and I'll spend that time doing something else. But I think for a lot of people, simplifying things for
Hmm.
them so that they will make something
Hmm.
at home and it's not so overwhelming for them, which is great about your approach to that you're really thinking about, is this something that someone's going to do, and how can I encourage them and make it easy for them.
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing I learned when I started my column at the San Francisco Chronicle was people don't have help. It's usually them washing the dishes. So if I can tell them, can you accomplish all of this just mixing everything in a bowl and then pouring it? I think those are the things where kind of put yourself in someone else's shoes to see if they can achieve this and at what level. And one of the things you mentioned is also, can people actually tell the difference between like something so subtle in terms of flavor, aroma, and taste? Those are also things we need to like think about because maybe they don't really need to do that at home, right? Just to get that thing that they won't even pay attention to. Um, so I think those are the kind of things we really need to be more conscious about when we write recipes for other people.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there other areas where in food science where either a traditional way, like tempering eggs, for example, you make a
Mhm.
lot of ice cream, so you know, I imagine you do the cold start method rather than traditional tempering. But I mean, I don't really know what your approach is. But are there areas like that where you think there are things, even if they're known, but maybe not widely known, that you think are good for people to understand about how to approach things like that?
I think one of the things that at least, let's see, I think I don't, since I didn't go to high school yet, I don't know really know what is taught to people in school about cooking. I do feel there is kind of a knowledge gap in when I meet people and I talk to them, they haven't, and I'll ask them, like, did you learn about something very basic in school? And they said no. But like just understanding how cooking works and why things work a certain way, just the basics. Like, most of our cooking involves some kind of heat application. And so what is happening? So kind of understanding those kind of things. I'll give you an example. I'm working on my next book, and a lot of it has to do with it's a very science book, very science-based book, and more so than I've ever written. But I'm also trying to incorporate things that are done traditionally in certain cultures, and I'm trying to use really simple methods that I know of that are used in kitchens, and to make those in Excel techniques accessible at home. And I'm being so vague here, but it's I think there is a way to achieve those things. And so teaching people why they're doing things a certain way is so important because once you know that, then you have the freedom to make things at home and do it your own way. Like when I tell people, I'm roasting onions and I prefer browning onions in the oven because I do not like sitting at the stove waiting for it to proceed. And also, it's just so inconvenient on the stove because keep a lot of people give too much oil in their recipes when they're browning onions. I've seen people use anywhere from 1/4 cup of oil to half cup of oil. Some say that they're using 2 tablespoons of oil, but if you're doing it in a pot, it dries out really fast and it does burn. So if you do it in the oven, everything's cooking almost at the same rate. You just move it once in a while a little bit around and it browns really well. So kind of these kind of things where if it's going to make your life easy, you don't have to sit next to it all the time. And knowing why it's working is so important because the oven circulates air better. In a pot on the stove, the surface area is so small, there's too much heat coming through. And it's going to burn really fast. Sometimes you may have enough oil, you may not have enough oil. Those are the kind of things I want people to kind of take away, is that the science is there, you're applying it, but understand why you're doing what you're doing. There's a logic to it. You don't have to salt everything. In fact, I know one of the things a lot of chefs probably don't agree with me on this is that salt as you go. Some people love salting as they go. I think we have too much salt in our foods, and I don't add salt to desserts. In fact, this is something I learned when I moved to America, is that Americans add salt to desserts a lot. And if you look at European cookbooks, you look at cookbooks from other parts of the world, they don't add salt as they go. And they don't add salt to dessert. So that for me is something is very strange. And so I always tell people, don't add salt. Yeah, taste as you go, as long as the dish is safe to taste, taste it as you go. But you can always add salt at the end. It's going to dissolve. It's going to be fine. So, those are the kind of things I think people need to understand. Yeah, you sometimes do need to add salt if you're cooking onions because it'll help the pectin break down faster. Or to meat, it'll help, the osmosis. So, yeah, in those situations,
Right.
yes, but you really don't need to add it all along. And so you can have healthier diets and cook more efficiently that way.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, oh, there's a lot of things going through my mind right now. But with salting, I agree with you that most chefs would disagree with you. But I think it depends on what you're making.
Yeah,
As you
absolutely. Yeah.
mentioned, with meat, salt's going to prevent the proteins from bonding so tightly. It's going to allow them to retain more moisture. With eggs, same thing. If you mix eggs, like you're making scrambled eggs and you mix it ahead of time, then you're going to have a softer curd that way. So I think there are cases where it makes sense to do it, or it's something where you want the salt to penetrate the food so that it's not just on the outside. But if you're trying to decrease the amount of salt in your diet, having that salt more front on your tongue, where you're tasting it more, means you can use less. Maybe the food's not as seasoned as well as it could be, but that's a good way to decrease the amount of salt and still get that saltiness. And so I think it's more complicated than you should always do it this way or you should always do it this way.
Absolutely. And one of the things I always tell people is read the back of your ingredients on your bottle, because a lot of times, like I've seen recipes, so I use the cream cheese method to make a lot of my ice creams. I don't use egg. And I've seen people who also use the cream cheese method and they'll say add a pinch of salt. Cream cheese is already so salted. If you're using kimchi and cooking with those kind of things like preserved lemons, there's a lot of salt that's already loaded in there. So be conscious about that. And I see like a lot of people will just keep throwing salt when they're cooking. And when they're cooking with ingredients like this, and they've written recipes like that, published books, and it shocks me because it makes no sense. And also with desserts, yes, with bread, if I'm making bread, add a little bit salt. It does more than taste there, right? Like it changes the gluten, it changes the
Right.
hydration of starch and all that stuff. But if I'm making a cake, I sometimes don't add salt. I just don't, because I don't think it needs it. And I think these are the things I think we really need to learn how to taste properly. That is something that I think we need to learn how to taste without salt, without sugar constantly. That's how you train your palate, because you need to appreciate flavors as blank, in their native state versus constantly in the background of something else. Because salt and sugar, they do change the perception of some tastes. That's something to remember. And then we also have temperature that changes the appreciation of certain tastes as well. And I think that those are some of the basics that I think a lot of cooks need to understand and learn. That you don't always need to do those things. It's not a hard and fast rule, but I think you really need to understand how taste and flavor works before just blindly going into it.
Right. And I always tell my students, you always need to season your final seasoning at the temperature that you're going to be eating it,
Hmm.
because if it's colder or warmer, you're not going to be able to taste it as well. And so if you season it when it's too hot or too cold, it's not going to be the right amount of seasoning. So yeah, temperature is super important, and there's some other factors, and I think that the training is right as well in terms of kind of what we're used to, and I think some of the reason for this goes back to, again, the traditional methods, which are there because they worked for someone
Hmm. Hmm.
to some degree, and then they passed it down. And as you know, the sort of chef
Yeah.
world is like, you do it the way your chef tells you
Yeah.
to, and then you pass it down that way. And so
Yeah.
people don't take the time to go, wait a minute, does this really make sense? And try doing these different things. And that's why I think food science is so important for people to understand, so that they really understand why you put salt in dough, or why you put
Hmm.
salt, what chemical or physical effect it may be having on the food, other than just how we taste it. So if they are armed with that knowledge, then they can maybe change the approach to how they're doing things, or question. And I think it's really important to question. If there's something on TikTok with 7 million views, doesn't mean it's right. Or even if it's coming from Escoffier or Carême
Yeah.
or whoever, we should question those things, and revisit them, and really do the work to say, okay, is this the best way to do it, and try different ways.
Hmm. Absolutely. And I think that's one thing you're taught in science is that always question. My professors always said, like, question even what we tell you in class, because that's the way you're supposed to think. That's how you develop your intuition. And you should have that urge to be curious. And I think at the end of the day, even with cooks, we're all curious about cooking, what makes the perfect dish or the perfect flavor combination. So I think being curious and questioning what you've been told is so important, because that's how you get there.
Right. And you mentioned the perfect flavor combination, which is also going to be different for everyone, right?
Hmm.
I mean, some people are
Absolutely.
well, everyone's anosmic to some things, and
Hmm.
so and people have based on what they grow up with, and the foods that they grow up with, and having those
Yeah.
emotional attachments to foods are going to be different for different people. And even, I mean, you having moved from India to the United States, I'm sure you carry with you a lot of emotion tied to certain foods and certain flavors or aromas that are going to influence how you make things. And that
Absolutely.
might be different from someone who has the same heritages with you but grew up in the US.
Yeah, emotion is such an important emotion, and memories actually the most important things that I guess are the forces that influence our decisions and how we cook, what we taste. A lot of things that my parents forced me to eat and I hated, I don't bring them even into the house anymore. Um, like bitter melon, and I know a lot of Asians and even Indians love bitter melon, and I'll always say, people ask me, do you have like a really great bitter melon recipe? And I said, no, I hate it because I hated it as a child, and now that I live independently, it does not come in my house. So no, I don't like it.
Yeah.
But there are things that I love that that just make me really happy. Things that I've experienced here, certain flavors and foods make me really happy, so I run to them really fast. And I think that's something that like we've been alluding to this quite a bit throughout the whole conversation, is that a lot of our decisions are just influenced by how emotionally attached we are. Even the style of cooking you mentioned, like people, chefs are trained by their chefs, and home cooks are often trained by grandmas and mothers, and so emotions, right or wrong, kind of drive us in that direction, and then that influences the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me a little bit more about your next book, and when it's coming out, and kind of what the main, you said it's more scientifically based, but what's your sort of main theme?
So this it isn't a sequel to the Flavor Equation, which was my second book, but I would say it kind of starts from there. It's a book that's more focused about how flavor develops versus how we appreciate flavor. There's a little bit of that in there. I'm being so vague because the book comes out in fall 2025.
Okay.
It's I would say the chunkiest book I've ever written. And but one of the things that I loved about this book is that realized that I really love writing those sciencey books because I'm learning so much stuff constantly. And I've had to go into, like, I've been talking to people who work at NASA to kind of understand how, like, food works and how food techniques work, because, people in different parts of, I guess, science are doing different things, either directly or tangentially related to food. And so for me, that's been such a fun part about this book, is that trying to understand how flavor develops from a more broader scientific perspective versus just coming into it as more as a biologist or a chemist, as I did with the flavor equation. In this book, it's a lot, there's like physics, there's a little bit of math. And so I've been enjoying that aspect so much because it's giving me personally, I don't know if other authors feel this is so weird to say, but maybe there's a gap in yourself when you're writing a book. And then when you finish the book, that gap gets filled. That's how I feel like what this book is doing for me. And it has actually been the book. Flavor Equations told me that maybe I should get back into research. This book is telling me this is the kind of research maybe you should consider. And I've it's just been such an enjoyable experience. I'm sitting with all my textbooks on this side. You can't see them, but it's been such a joyful experience because I'm learning so much about things that I had preconceived notions of, and they're changing. And for me, that's been the most rewarding experience, and that's something that I love when I do books that are focused on research.
Oh, it sounds great. I'm sure I will get it immediately and read it. So, Nick, is there anything else that you want to mention before we finish up here?
One of the things I tell people is always keep an open mind. See how people outside your microcosm are doing things. Because I think that's something that I've learned to do as a cook as well as a writer, is to see how people approach the same conversation in a different way. Not only does it apply generally to life, but also in cooking, it becomes very important because someone might have an easier, better way to do something. So keep an open mind about that. Try new things all the time, because I think one of the things about being in this world is that we are challenging our senses, overloading them constantly. Enjoy that experience. So try new things constantly. And uh, like I said earlier, like, take a moment, pause, and enjoy the moment.
Yeah, that's great advice. Well, thank you so much for being here. It's been great talking to you. It's really interesting. This is like exactly the kind of stuff that I love. So I really appreciate your time.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation.